Tonight I'll keep you company while the sky slows down. Imagine a control room after midnight, screens dimmed, the air a little cool, and one thin, steady line of radio light touching a quiet nerve you didn't know you had. Where were you the first time you realized that space can keep a rhythm? I'll speak softly, close enough to feel like a hand resting on the back of a chair. We won't hurry. We'll listen the way tide pools listen to the ocean, taking in a pulse, letting it go, and learning from what remains. The story is simple. A visitor between stars, instruments tuned with care, and a pattern that feels both surprising and familiar. We'll let the facts be anchors and the spaces between them be the gentle water that carries you toward sleep. Before we begin, make yourself comfortable. Lower the light. If it helps, put on headphones and set your phone to Do Not Disturb. You can follow the Sleepy Science playlist for more nights like this, though there's nothing you need to do now but breathe and let curiosity soften at the edges. I'll guide you with a calm voice, smoothing each turn until the path feels inevitable. No rush, no jolts, just a measured walk through what was heard, how it was checked, and why the pattern likely belongs to nature doing something elegant. When your mind wants a sharper answer, I'll offer one. When it wants a softer shore, I'll offer that too. The room is quiet, the instruments are listening, and the rhythm is waiting just ahead. This is where we start. Where do you place your attention when silence learns a beat? I was with a radio dish tucked in a valley, night pinned gently to the hills, when a line on the screen rose with an intention that didn't feel like noise. Not a shout, not a flare. A thin silver tick that arrived, rested, and left the graph smoother than it found it. I watched once, twice, and then I counted in breath lengths rather than numbers, because numbers can make a mind hurry. The dish kept listening. I kept breathing. The tick returned, as if a distant lighthouse had turned a calm face toward us, then away. Procedure asks for patience before excitement. I checked timestamps against the clock that keeps our system honest. Calibrators had behaved earlier in the night. Receivers were sitting where they should. I pulled a little wedge of the recording aside, ran the usual quick tests, and coaxed the background down until only the core remained. When a pattern stays visible after you take its edges away, you notice. I wrote a brief note, flagged the log, and felt the room become a touch more awake, not brighter, just attentive. In that way, a library gets attentive when someone turns a page. Sharing begins with coordinates and humility. I sent the essentials to colleagues who live inside different night skies, each with a dish of their own and a habit of kind scrutiny. Here is the patch, the message said, without drama. Here is the slice of spectrum we were watching, and here is the rhythm we think we see. You can feel a quiet chorus even before replies arrive, the sense that minds have turned in your direction, that more than one instrument is finding the same needle in the same dark cloth. We all like our surprises repeated by other hands. We all sleep better that way. The room went still. Air handlers moved a soft ribbon of wind. A pen rolled a little and stopped. On the wall, a faint map of the sky settled into its pale grey, as if it too were listening. Distant electronics breathed their steady hush. A cup felt warm, then less so, the arc of heat trailing off to meet the cool that waits in every midnight room. Somewhere outside, a late truck sighed along the road and drifted away. I leaned back, let my shoulders descend, and allowed the small, persistent tick to join the quiet like a metronome for rest rather than work. Patterns are easy to overstate, so I let the next hour teach me softly. The interval wasn't a perfect clock. It breathed a little. Sometimes the crest stood taller, sometimes smaller, as if a turning surface had uneven patches of shine. My notes say patient spacing, mild drift, amplitude and gentle sway. But what I felt was simply this: the lighthouse turning, the beam thinning, the beam returning. The thin silver tick kept time with something that rotated beyond our air, and the graph began to look less like a stranger's voice and more like weather, from a sky we were just starting to learn. Earth loves to intrude, so I invited it to show its hand. Known transmitters were mapped out for the band we watched. Passing satellites had their own schedule. None matched the moments on my screen. We tipped the dish a little off source and back again, as you do when you want to know whether a sound belongs to the room or to the world. Off source, the line relaxed into the customary wash. On source, the tick returned, modest as a heartbeat. You only hear when the pillow is right. Cross-checks dulled the cheap explanations until the expensive ones, the honest ones, remained. I've learned to trust the pace that keeps a mind from running ahead of its feet, so I stayed with the simple truths. A repeatable rise, a patient interval, a narrow patch of spectrum, and a second set of eyes already turning toward the same place in the sky. Because one instrument can be lucky, but two instruments are disciplined, and three make a story that stands up even when the day comes and asks it to explain itself plainly. The thin silver tick stayed steady enough to be believed, and gentle enough to invite care. By the time the first confirmations began to murmur back, the night had settled into a deeper kind of ease. We would keep listening. Others would keep listening. The ocean of quiet would hold a small light that rose and set, with no need to hurry us or frighten us. In that rhythm, I felt the work fall into place. Screens dim, shoulders soften. The lighthouse far away turns once more, and the valley receives its faint, faithful sweep. Fade with it now, and let the tick be a low star you carry into sleep. The second voice rose from a different horizon. Mountains shouldered a cool dawn as a great bowl of metal exhaled a soft servo sigh and leaned into the sky. Air thinned over the valley, the ground seemed to hold its breath. I could almost hear a low, brushed tone that wasn't sound at all, just the sensation of a giant instrument taking aim. When the first trace arrived, it didn't leap. It steadied. It sat like a fingertip on a glass rim, and the room around me felt a hair more focused, the way a studio tightens when someone sets the tempo. This was a companion to our first finding, a second ear turning, a second graph humming with the same quiet intent. Far to the south, under a hard, bright sweep of stars, dozens of dishes lifted as one. Their collective gaze stitched the thin air above a high desert, where stones cool fast after sunset. I pictured cables resting like sleeping snakes, the control room soft lit, operators carrying a patience that only long nights can teach. The graphs began, as they always do, with the usual pebbled texture of the universe, and then a regular rise inked itself upon the line. Not crisp like a ruler's mark, not theatrical, just present. A shared note again. You could feel relief cross the network like a small breeze through open windows. Now came the alignment work. Time is the string that lets far-flung hands play the same bar, so we pulled each thread taut. Clocks were already disciplined, but we checked them anyway, because good habits are how you buy trust. Arrival moments slid into a common frame. We shaped the data so each listening ear could stand shoulder to shoulder with the next. Then we watched the little crests move together in their slow walk across the band. On one screen, the rises looked a touch early. On another, a touch late. Exactly as geometry predicts when the Earth turns, and each instrument catches the same wave from a slightly different angle. What mattered was the heartbeat between them. The interval breathed in the same way across continents. Amplitude swayed, as if a textured surface were turning in light, offering stronger faces and softer ones as it spun. Phase comparisons told a gentle truth. 3 dishes, thousands of kilometers apart, were touching the same rhythm as it passed. That kind of agreement doesn't shout. It simply declines the easy counter-stories. The shared note held. In the chat windows, the language stayed careful. We do not call a chorus until the tuning forks sing the same pitch. Here, they did. Let the room fall into the little noises that carry a minute without asking for attention. A kettle, half empty, clicks as it cools. Paper breathes when air moves past a corner. A chair remembers the last person who leaned on it, and creaks once, then settles. Outside, the night thins a shade lighter, though your eyes might not name it yet. Screens whisper a pale blue that could be sky if you don't look directly. Somewhere a fan spins. It draws a thin, steady line in the air and sets your thoughts adrift in time with its patience. You notice, then forget, then notice again, and each noticing loosens a small knot in the day you carried here. The graphs stay quiet, companions at the edge of vision. The shared note continues, neither insistent nor shy, simply balanced on the narrow bridge between distance and attention. With the basic shape established, we kept our public voices practiced and plain, because once a pattern feels orderly, there's a temptation to crown it too soon, and the world beyond our rooms can catch fire faster than facts can walk. Draft statements moved with gentle edits from one lab to another, avoiding fences built of certainty, and phrases that would make tomorrow's corrections harder to hear. And we reminded ourselves that modesty is a form of speed, that it carries results further than a flourish ever will, and that the cleanest sentence is the one that will still be true after a long sleep and a cooler head, and the next day's better plot of the same sky. When more sets joined, an almost domestic warmth spread through the work. A few small antennas in quiet fields drew faint echoes that still matched the cadence. Private channels shared screenshots like postcards. Here is our line, here is yours. Look how they travel together. We traded tiny adjustments and kept the tone like a good rehearsal, generous with attention, sparing with adjectives. Underneath the logistics and the steady, careful words, something softer gathered. It felt like a room full of craftsmen tapping the same block of wood, listening for the ring that says yes, this is sound, this is structure, this is not a trick of the light. The shared note lingered. Then the colours of our many plots washed gently into one another, as if the night itself were doing the dissolving for us. The rhythm was not a clock, it was a turn. Each crest arrived with the patience of a hand winding a small mechanism and then letting it breathe. The spacing hovered near that familiar 40-something seconds, Not rigid, not sloppy, the way a lighthouse beam thins as it crosses a window and fattens again when the glass is square. Amplitude rose and fell as if a textured face rotated under a mild sun. I wrote it as a note first and a number second, because the ear carried the truth cleanly. This felt like a body in motion, not a bell struck once and left to ring. We place the slow swing beside timelines of the object's path and let geometry do its quiet work. When a surface turns, bright patches take turns with duller ones. When an environment turns, denser swirls trade places with thinner air. The envelope on our plots moved just like that, a gentle envelope that breathed in and out while the interval kept time within a kindly tolerance. Nothing demanded perfection. Nothing insisted on chaos. The turning key was steady, and the little teeth inside the music box caught and released with a soft regularity that settled the room. Let the room be simple for a minute. A pencil rests where you left it. The heater ticks once and quits. A window frame hums the faintest bit when night air brushes past it. Somewhere, a distant car idles, then fades until it is only a suggestion, like a thought you decide not to keep. Your breath chooses a slow lane. Shoulder muscles step down one stair, then another. In the next room, a book remembers being closed and lies still, edges aligned, the day's heat leaving its pages like steam leaving a cup. You are listening to quiet motion, which is the easiest kind to trust. On the spectrum itself, a small drift traced a line you could follow with one finger. As the visitor pulled farther from the center of our family, frequency leaned lower by a sliver, a Doppler sigh that matched what the math predicts when distance grows. Arrival times changed by those tiny amounts you would expect as our planet rotated, and each dish met the same wave from a slightly different angle. Nothing showed the sharp jumps you get from stray machinery or an airplane's impatient sweep. The turning story held together even as the Earth did its own turning beneath it. I set these curves beside the messy radio a comet offers when sunlight peels gases into the open. Those signals tend to sputter. Their intervals wander the way an old neon sign flickers when the transformer tires. Here, the cadence was far kinder. The signal behaved like a small orchestra section riding a conductor's visible hand, not like a street corner where many conversations jostle and overlap. That didn't crown an answer. It just narrowed the lane. The music box kept playing, and the comparisons lost their appetite for drama. Our colleagues who read polarization like weather maps added a page. They showed that the wave leaned more one way than another, not a tangled tumble, but a preferred plane that rotated gently as it crossed space, dense with electrons. The implication was quiet, not loud. Fields were organized enough near the source to give the radio light a consistent tilt. That is the kind of sign a turning charged environment leaves without intending to. It is also the kind of sign that lets you listen closer without inventing a story that the data do not require. Put these pieces in a row and the outline becomes simple enough to hold before sleep. A solid or mostly solid traveller, likely with patches that conduct better than their neighbours, moves through the sun's steady wind. Rotation makes those patches take turns facing the stream. Charged particles trace loops and arcs, and when conditions line up, they shed a little energy as radio light in a band where our instruments are comfortable. The amplitude sways because the patchwork is uneven. The interval breathes because natural systems do. The whole thing is modest and kind to the nerves. Once seen, it was hard not to hear it, as a tune you could nearly hum. A soft metronome near 47 seconds, an envelope that swelled and rested like a chest under a blanket. A pitch that slid the smallest amount as distance did what distance always does. And a grain in the light that said a tidy field lay where the visitor turned, like a winding key brushed by a thumb every time it came back into view, so that the box would keep playing, even though no one had intended a concert at all, and the hall was the whole dark between planets. All of this lives comfortably inside nature. It is the kind of elegance that appears when a few simple things align: motion, charge, and attention. That's why it feels designed, while not requiring a designer. You can fall asleep to that. You can let the room be only a room, the graphs be only a whisper of geometry, written in a language the night already knows how to speak. The key turns again. The music box does what it was built by physics to do. And the cadence settles into the hush that carries you forward without asking for anything more. Freeze the frame. A spectrum sits like a photograph that picked up a little room dust, and I lift a soft brush to the glass. That is how I think of the first pass. Not hunting, not arguing, just removing what never belonged to the picture. We begin with the catalogues that map where human hum lives. There are bands we keep for ourselves, corridors where radars speak, places where links skip across the world, and slopes where nobody should shout, but sometimes does. I pull down the masks we trust, lay them like tracing paper over the plot, and shade out the lanes that cannot be believed on sight. The line we care about stays visible through the frosted overlay. The brush moves once more. The dust lifts. What remains looks like a stroke the painter meant to leave. Satellites love this part of the sky, so we treat them as neighbours whose schedules must be known before we call anything our own. We line up their paths with our listening windows and angles. The bright ones have predictable crossings. Their talk follows familiar habits. Their reflections arrive with a geometry you can check. We set the dish to catch them when they pass, and teach the software to recognize their gait. When you subtract their footprints, the canvas gets calmer. The small crest we watch stands where no pass was due, and it keeps standing there when later passes come and go on time. Side lobes can play tricks, so we tilt a little to see if the trick follows. It doesn't. The brush stays gentle. The intended stroke stays put. There are echoes that borrow the sky for a moment and give it back. Some bounce off layers of charged air, some scatter sideways through weathered air, some skip from bright, metal moving quickly, but those live in friendlier frequencies and leave behind jagged edges where a smooth line should sit. We watch the upper air in the bands that matter. We take notes from the stations that live to measure it. We fold in the dull, practical facts about how transparent this band is to the layers above. A clean pass at these wavelengths means fewer hiding places for wayward echoes. The crest we keep glides on without the scratches that bounces make. It behaves like a thing written far away, crossing cleanly, not reflecting back from our own ceiling. Any instrument can fool itself, so we ask ours to prove it isn't. We nudge the pointing a little off source and watch the line relax into the ordinary wash. We nod back on and the crest returns, patient as ever. We swap polarization and see the weight shift the way a sky-borne wave would, not the way a local cable leak would. We throw a blank patch of sky into the path as a reference and find it blank indeed. We roll test tones through the receivers to catch intermodulation ghosts. The ghosts decline to match the rhythm on our screen. Then we widen the circle. One site paints a null, while another paints the line, perfectly consistent with where their dishes look. The brush clears a little more varnish. The colours underneath are steady. What survives such ordinary cleaning is what earns the time to be studied. After the masks and the passes and the echoes and the self-questions, the signal still draws the same modest rise in the same small neighbourhood of the band. It breathes, because all real things do, but it doesn't stutter the way a cheap intruder would. Its shape carries the little signatures that travel well across long distances. A lean toward one plane, a sigh that fits the slow change of distance, a steadiness that outlives our schedule tweaks. It isn't flawless. That's how you know it isn't pretending. We keep the stroke, not because we want it, but because we tried to remove it, and it stayed. Let the room widen for a minute and host a quiet the data cannot provide by themselves. A lamp warms a circle on the desk and leaves the corners to the kind dark. A sleeve whispers on wood when an elbow shifts. The night sneaks a cooler thread under the door and folds it into the warmer air without complaint. Somewhere a refrigerator hums one note lower than a fan across the hall. Your breathing makes the simplest kind of tide. The brush rests on the lip of the tray. Pigment settles. The painting that is our plot looks cleaner than it did an hour ago. Edges eased, surface freed of what kept your eye busy. Nothing leaps, nothing pleads. You can fall into it the way you fall into a page you've meant to read slowly for months. When all the practical courtesies are done, we end up with something small and resilient. We cannot promise away every earthly whisper. No honest listener can. What we can show is that the chorus of ordinary causes does not sing in the same voice as the line we are following. The line ignores their schedules, refuses their angles, and keeps its place when the room changes. That is enough to move forward with a kinder heart. It lets us spend our attention where attention pays interest. The soft brush goes back to its place. The photograph of the spectrum lies cleaner on the table, and the picture looks exactly like it did before we started, only easier to believe. Page turned, hush held. Think of sunlight as wind, and of space as a long hallway with loose strings. When that wind flows, the strings answer. Not loudly, not all at once. A warm draft finds a surface, leans across it, and something faint begins to sing. The numbers that share the mood say the same thing in a cooler voice. The stream from our star usually runs a few hundred kilometers each second, sometimes quicker when storms lift from the surface and fling charged snow into the wide black. Speeds near 400 to 800 are common, like a river choosing its faster channel after rain. You do not feel it on your skin, yet our instruments do, and the visitor between planets seemed to feel it most of all. On nights when the solar wind thickened, our little crest grew a shade taller. The pattern wasn't theatrical. It was neighbourly, like a quiet knock at the door a short while after an upstream bend sent more water our way. Space weather dashboards showed shocks and higher densities rolling past the monitors that keep watch near Earth. Hours later, our amplitude would swell with the kind of modesty that lets you keep breathing slow. Then, as the flow relaxed, the crest eased back down, as if the draft had moved along to a different corridor. It was not perfect sync. Nature rarely bothers with perfect sync. Yet, the rhyme was there, strong enough to count, gentle enough to trust. How could wind make music without a bow or a reed? Not by magic, only by induction, which is the ordinary habit of charges when moving fields invite them to take a walk. Imagine surfaces that conduct a little, patches of metal-rich grain stitched among stone. The stream sweeps past, and currents stir over those patches the way a breeze wakes a suspended wire. Rotation turns one patch into view, then another. The strings, if we can call them that, are not strings at all, but paths where charge likes to gather and let go. When they let go, a low radio light appears, not as a power plant would make it, but as an Aeolian harp would. Effortless, patterned by shape and weather, never the same twice, and still recognizable. Let the room borrow that same soft draft. A vent whispers. Pages lift at one corner and settle again with a sound like silk. Heat from a mug rises a hand's breadth, and then disappears into air that's learned your temperature. There's a small reflection in the window, a lamp nested inside night, and beyond it a deeper dark that feels less like absence and more like wool, pulled up to your chin. Somewhere in the wall a wire hums a steady line. You could put your hand near it and feel nothing, yet your attention bends toward the steadiness, as if steadiness had a scent. The graphs wait without insisting. The hum waits without changing. The warm draft in the story and the one in the room agree on one thing only. That quiet motion is enough to make a tone. Back at the crest, composition had its say. Conductors accept the invitation more readily than rock. A patchwork surface with veins of iron and nickel will carry charge in ways a glassy, dusted crust will not. If the visitor's skin is a quilt of such regions, each seam, each brighter grain, could serve as a short, temporary path for energy to round itself, and then slip away as radio light. This doesn't demand a single solid block of metal, it prefers variety. Uneven conductors, uneven faces, uneven weathering under the sun. Those are the textures that turn a draft into a melody you can measure. We tested what prediction a melody like that permits. When space weather forecasts suggested a faster stream or a passing shock, we wrote small, unfussy notes. Expect a rise within this window. Nothing more ambitious than that. Sometimes the bump came almost where we guessed, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, and sometimes not at all, because the river between source and instrument owns more eddies than any model can hold. Yet even with that humility, the correlation felt sturdy. Stronger wind, stronger song, calmer wind, softer line. Not a prophecy, a tide table. Close enough to set our attention, never close enough to treat as a promise. You can spend many nights in the small mechanics of this and not run out of patience. A field met by moving charges returns a field of its own. Patches reorient as they turn into and out of the flow. Some cycles like to live at the same scale as our interval, and their overlap feels like intention, even when it is only the arithmetic of motion and material. What soothed me was not the sharpness of the fit, but the lack of strain required to explain it. The harp lifted its little voice whenever the warm draught found it. When the hallway stilled, the song dimmed. The rest was detail and the pleasure of being careful. I kept the metaphors on a short leash and returned to the graphs. The crest remained narrow, leaning the same way it had leaned during weaker weather, only standing higher. The spacing still breathed near that 40-something seconds, and the slight drift in pitch that distance writes into every signal continued its slow descent, unbothered by the sun's louder moods. Nothing in the shape argued for anything sudden. Growth was a matter of degree, not kind. That is how induced songs behave. They take what the wind gives and no more. There were nights when the link seemed to break, and those taught their own lesson. A forecasted surge arrived, and the crest barely moved. Went looking for reasons, and found the old culprits. Geometry that left the visitor half-turned, local noise that ate a little too much sky, or a pocket of calmer plasma along the path that tempered the blow. The failures to crest were as important as the crests themselves. They reminded us that the harp is not alone. The hallway is long, drafts collide and cancel and return with new shapes. Returning to the quiet belief, stronger wind, stronger song, required nothing more than a few more nights stacked neatly together. In the morning version of the control room, when the first tea of the day replaces last night's late coffee, we lay the sequence out, end to end. Speed here, density there, a ring around the times when the sun seemed to speak more loudly, and a matching ring around our visitor's answer. It is a kind, unsurprising story. A body turns in a river of charged air. Some parts of its skin carry currents more easily than others. Those currents give up a small fraction of their energy as radio light, where our receivers are happiest. When the river runs faster, the skin glows a little brighter in that band. When it slows, the glow relaxes. The melody goes on either way. It needs no permission from us. That is enough for sleep. The harp at the window does not know music, it only knows wind and shape. The warm draft passes and sets it humming, then passes again and leaves it still. We listen, because listening is a way to feel the room you're in and the star that warms it, both at once. Stay with the detail for one more breath, the thin line standing a few counts taller, the steady tilt of its light, the corridor the wind chooses tonight, and let that detail linger the way a fingertip lingers on a final string after the note has already gone into the quiet. Patterns can feel designed and still be the most natural thing in the room. That gentle tension is the thread I follow tonight. On our plots, the rhythm behaves with courtesy, not menace, and yet a tidy cadence can trick a tired mind into hearing intention. The shuttle of thought moves across the loom and wants to weave a message. I let it move once, then guide it back to cloth we can touch. We have seen order without authors before. We have watched nature keep time for reasons that have nothing to do with plans. The shuttle returns, the cloth holds, and the pattern stays patient enough for sleep. Long ago, a different rhythm startled another night. In 1967, a crisp ticking arrived from a small patch of sky, so steady that the first chalk note on the lab board joked about little green senders. The sending never came. The physics did. The sources were stars collapsed into needles of density, spinning fast, their beams sweeping like precise lighthouses. Pulsars made a neat music because their mechanisms were neat. Our visitor's cadence is slower, softer, and far less exacting, a hand-stitched seam rather than a machine-cut edge. The comparison doesn't flatten it. It simply reminds us that order is not a signature, only a habit the universe falls into when geometry and energy meet. Another chapter in this memory book opens on flashes that last a heartbeat and live far beyond our neighborhood. Fast radio bursts can crackle once and vanish, or repeat by moods that took years to recognize. One repeater even showed an on-off window, a timetable of activity that looked suspiciously like appointment keeping until better data taught patience. Periodicity does not require purpose. It only needs a system with cycles, rotation, orbit, precession, plasma currents that gather and release. Against that history, our Benoit 7 second breathing feels small and comfortable. The loom makes a motif because the shuttle must return. We see the motif because our eyes love Rose. Closer to home, a giant planet and its volcanic moon conduct a louder lesson. Jupiter's environment hums in radio, some tones tied to Io's path and the way charged particles inject into the magnetosphere. At lower frequencies, the emissions burst and dance. At higher ones, the belts shine with synchrotron glow. None of this is a perfect match to our narrow crest near 10 gigahertz, but the family resemblance matters. A magnetic field, a supply of charged particles, and a geometry that modulates the view can turn motion into measure. Our traveller is not a planet, not a lighthouse star, yet it borrows small behaviours from both and scales them down until the song becomes a whisper you can miss if you blink. Let the room weave the same lesson while your attention loosens. A pull chain makes a tiny brass sound, and the lamp dims one notch. Fabric remembers the shape of your shoulder and settles. The hallway keeps its cool and sends a faint current under the door, a draft gentle enough to sway a loose page, but not to flip it. Outside, a late elevator sighs somewhere in the spine of the building, then holds still. On the desk, a pencil lies parallel to a ruled line, like a quiet promise to stop measuring for a while. The shuttle moves, the cloth holds, the pattern is simply the repetition of simple things. Nothing asks you for an answer. The nerves accept that invitation. Back on the plots, the field leans the wave the same way on many nights. Polarization prefers one orientation, then rotates slowly as the radio light passes through seas of electrons between us and the source. That quiet tilt argues for structure near the emitter, not a tangle. A modest environment can still be organized, a sheath where charges swirl, a surface with conductive veins, a local pocket of plasma that likes to behave. The loom can be plain and still make clean cloth. When the solar wind nudges harder, the pattern brightens but does not change its weave, as if the shuttle quickened without dropping a stitch. Order that looks planned often blooms from systems nudged just right. A magnetized flow can self-organize into filaments. Rotating plasmas can prefer certain motions. Cavities can ring, then hush, then ring again. Even random pushes will sync if their couplings are steady. The mathematics of that isn't a drum roll, it's a lullaby. Driven, damped, and slightly misaligned, a system will find the path of least complaint. The soft groove where energy comes in and slips away on a schedule. It writes for itself. And the writing repeats because the forces are simple, and the shapes are few, and the universe loves to reuse good ideas when it can do so without inventing new ones at all. So I treat the neatness of our crest as kindness, not confession. A neat cadence tells me we're listening to a small rivalry between motion and field, not to any voice with a plan. The loom image stays helpful here. Threads under tension, a shuttle passing, a pattern not designed, but guaranteed by the way the frame is built. What we see could be a tiny engine of charged paths, skimming along conductive seams, modulated by rotation, answered by the wind from the sun. It feels composed, because balance always feels composed. It is natural, because nothing in it asks for more than the tools the night already carries. Let the lamp slip one more step down the dimmer, and let the cloth of this chapter slide from bright to soft without a fold. Su 14. UTC, a faint lift in the infrared trace, like a watercolor wash laid once and left to dry. On the radio screen, our thin crest waited in its usual place, breathing near that friendly interval, and on a second monitor, the mid-infrared thread rose the smallest amount, then settled. Not a flare, not a step, more like a fingertip warming a window pane. I wrote the time, drew a small circle around the rise, and let the two lines sit together until they felt like neighbours. The night had the feel of paper that takes ink well. A pale rainbow lived between instruments, quiet enough to miss if you hurried, clear enough to keep if you stayed. So 4:19 UTC, a handful of soft X-ray counts arrived on a screen that almost never asks for attention in a night like this. They perched just above the usual floor, timing themselves within the same window where infrared had leaned and radio had stood a little taller. If they were louder, they would argue. Being so faint, they only nodded. Radio, infrared, X-ray, 3 colors of the same slow breath. It read less like a coincidence and more like an orchestra section caught sight on from the back row, each instrument playing a line you recognize even when you cannot see the conductor's hands. Let the room drift with that spectrum for a minute. A clock face reflects a smudge of lamp gold, turning the numbers into soft islands in a shallow sea. One curtain edge lifts when the building sighs and returns to the sill with the slightest click, like porcelain touched by the rim of a fingernail. Somewhere outside, a car door closes far away, and the sound arrives thinner than it was, born, stretched by distance into something almost gentle. Your breath picks one color and follows it, then another, as if air itself were a prism, and rest was simply the sum of slowed wavelengths finding one place to be. The screens keep their faint glow, the graphs keep their posture. You are between colors now, and the place between colors is where sleep likes to begin. Near dawn, the optical plots joined in with their smaller signature. If you looked only at the visible light, you might miss it. A few % tilt in brightness tracing the slow turn of the traveller. Stacked over many nights, the pattern drew a humble sign that pointed to a multi-hour spin, a rotation that matched the way our radio amplitude widened and thinned. No commandment, only a consistency that felt like truth that was spoken quietly in a room that values quiet. In the margin, I wrote the period range with a pencil soft enough to erase later if the light curve decided to shift its manners by a fraction. The pale rainbow brightened by patience, rather than by power. We pressed the timelines together and asked only for tolerance, not perfection. Cross-correlations do not promise cause, they promise companionship. Infrared crests sat close to radio crests more often than chance would grant. The X-ray whispers arrived in the same neighborhoods on the clock, when the wind from the sun ran denser and our little crest stood taller. Sliding one series against the other by minutes and then hours gave the same kind answer. These bands like to keep company. Where the fit loosened, geometry could explain the gap. Where it tightened, the sense of a single, slow process strengthened, as if a battery charged by the wind and discharged by rotation were leaving fingerprints in different colors around the same time. The colors held composition hints the way watercolor holds texture from the paper beneath it. Mid-infrared features leaned towards silicates warmed just enough to glow and cool again. Optical spectra drew faint lines where iron oxides like to rest, and a trace of nickel that could be read as a seam in the surface, rather than as a promise of solid metal. We did not find the bright signatures of volatiles that comets confess when sunlight frees them. The skin looked dry, mottled, conductive in patches. A quilt, not a slab. The kind of quilt that likes to take charge briefly when a stream brushes across it, then lose that charge as a sigh of radio light and a pinch of heat you could measure if you were patient. I like the way the lines taught that lesson without drama. The radio crest rose when the wind quickened. Yes, but the infrared line did too, and that suggested we were not only hearing, but also feeling a small release of stored energy, a warm blush at the surface that faded as the draft passed on. The X-ray touches, faint and reluctant, fit a story in which tiny discharges near rough grains and edges threw off just enough high-energy light to notice when you had the luxury of long integration and a quiet night. Nothing in these colors demanded a new physics. They asked for the simplest kind: motion meeting field meeting matter, matter answering in the voices it always had. Think of it as a pale rainbow that never decides to become vivid. The long band receives the wind and glows a breath warmer. The short band counts the smallest sparks where charge leaves sudden paths. The middle band, our steady radio, writes the rhythm that holds the rest together. On some nights the colors stack neatly, on others they misalign by a little, the way waves on a shore arrive almost together. Then not, because of the shape of the bay and the breeze at the headland, and a boat that passed a few minutes before you looked. Across weeks, the pattern is still a pattern, and when you back away from the page, you can see the wash of it settling over the paper. The prism's quiet, the watercolor's patience, the feeling that you do not need to sharpen any line to believe the whole. By the time the sun took the edge off the cold, the picture was kind and complete enough for rest. We had a soft coupling across bands, a rotation slow enough to modulate light and field together, and a surface whose patchwork explained why the colors never matched perfectly but refused to forget one another. The horizon softened from slate to pearl. I watched the monitors fade their night posture and felt the chapter do the same, not ending so much as widening into daylight. The lines on the screens kept their tone. The sky went pale, the rainbow thinned until it felt like air. Let it drift there with the morning, and let your eyes wander to where the day begins without needing you just yet. Name what it is not. Not the room. We asked the room to speak first, and it refused, with good manners. Off-source nods washed the line back into ordinary static. On-source brought the thin crest home. Polarization swaps behaved like sky, not like a cable whispering to itself behind a rack. Blank patches stayed blank. Instrument tones went in and came out clean without building the 40-something second sway we keep seeing. Far away, other dishes found the same rise where we pointed, and found nothing where we didn't. Geometry changed the arrival by tiny amounts that matched the Earth's turning. Nothing dogged us like a local ghost that loves only one building. The room had its chance. It chose silence. Not the traffic above us. We walked satellite paths across our logs and saw their schedules pass politely by. Predicted downlinks came and went on time, in angles our beam would have caught if they were guilty. They were not. The frequencies they prefer were either masked out or wrong for what we heard. Side lobes tried their usual tricks. We tilted, and the tricks followed the tilt, while the crest we cared about refused to move. We looked for quick bounces from high air and found a band that is nearly transparent at these wavelengths, too clean for echoes to pretend this long. If there was a skip, it would have looked jagged, like light on broken water. Our line stayed smooth. Not a lighthouse star. Pulsars keep time with an authority our crest never claims. Their pulses are blades. Ours is a brushstroke. Their clocks live in milliseconds to seconds. Their energy climbs so high it writes its name on detectors from half a galaxy away, and their spectra favour other bands with a sharpness that would have cut through our plots like a bright wire. We borrowed their history to steady our thoughts, not to force a match. A gentle rhythm is not automatically a pulsar in slow motion. It is a smaller habit, scaled to a traveller without the mass or the field to keep such rigid time. Not the sudden fireworks from deep distances. Fast radio bursts are bright needles that stitch and vanish, some repeating by moods we've learned to respect. Even the repeaters that flirt with periodic windows do their work in short, hard syllables. Our crest is longer, quieter, and anchored to a body inside the family of our star. Its energy rises and falls with the sun's weather like a modest tide, not like an explosion that learned to whisper. The comparison is helpful only to remind us that rhythm alone never proves a sender with intentions. Not the busy breath of a comet letting go. When ice meets sunlight and vapor earns its freedom, radio light can mingle with dust and plasma in a way that makes graphs sputter. The intervals wander, the bands broaden, the chemistry writes bright signatures that even a tired eye can trace on a cold night. We looked for those and found little to keep. No strong waterlines to sing the usual chorus, no carbon dioxide stamp to mark a thaw. Our light curve turns, yes, but with the reliable hand of rotation and the modest modulation that conductive patches prefer. This is less a kettle rattling on the boil and more a dry bell rung by a passing breeze. Not a deliberate call. Discipline lives here. Narrow does not equal encoded. A rhythm does not equal a message. We looked for the fingerprints that artificial signals like to leave when they have to cross the solar system. Two precise drifts that show Doppler compensation. Scaffolds of sidebands that spell out engineering. Abrupt steps when a transmitter changes mode. We found none. Our cadence tolerates the kind of sway nature loves. The phase behaves like geometry. The amplitude follows weather no one could time from far away with such patient inconsistency. The field leans the wave the same way across nights as an organized environment would, not as a beacon would under a scripted plan. Calm curiosity keeps us honest. Restraint keeps us kind. What remains is a small island, and it is enough. A magnetized neighborhood, however modest, plus a river of charged particles, plus rotation, and a surface that accepts and sheds current unevenly. Cyclotron-like processes can sing in such places without drama. Resonance can bloom where density and field meet. A patch of metal-rich stone can act as a temporary path, along which charge gathers and leaves as radio light. The cadence lives where motion and field compromise. The tilt in polarization lives where order holds without needing a machine. The slight Doppler sigh lives where distance grows by hours and days instead of by the brutal thrust of a rocket engine. This island is natural and sturdy. You can sleep on it without worrying that the tide will take you. Let the room hold that island the way a sculptor holds a block and removes only what the piece is not. A pencil line marks a plane. A curl of dust turns in lamplight and settles. The chisel taps with a patience that slows your breath. From the street, a late bicycle whispers across a patch of gravel and becomes a memory just as it passes the window. The heater decides to be quiet for a while. In that pause, the mind loosens its grip on the last few arguments it meant to finish. The block becomes the figure always was. Chips fall. Grain shows. What's left is simple. It fits the hand. It needs no speech. So we leave the rumour lanes behind. No room-born whisper, no orbiting chatter, no lighthouse star, no distant burst, no thawing tale, no scripted call. What stands is a traveller with a patchwork skin turning in the wind of our star, answering in slow, repeatable light. The conclusion is not a verdict. It is a quiet assertion earned by removing what could not last. The shared note remains, seated where geometry says it should be, easing itself up and down when the sun breathes a little harder, tilting the way a well-behaved field tilts light, and making a case for nature's neatness that requires no messenger at all. Rest there a moment. Let the dust fall. The figure is already present. Begin with a field, a few charges, and a gentle pull. Picture a modest magnetic neighbourhood around a traveller of rock and metal. Lines of force curve like quiet lanes in a harbour, and electrons drift in spirals, the way small boats circle moorings when the tide turns. Where the flow from the sun presses, those paths tighten. Where the flow eases, they loosen. The radio light we see can be sketched from that motion. A little energy gathered, a little let go, a tone that sits in a narrow band because the environment prefers certain motions to others. Our plots offer their side of the story, a wave that leans the same way night after night, its plane of polarization rotating slowly as it crosses electron fog between stars and us. The kind of Faraday weather that makes a quiet meteorology out of space. The mechanism isn't exotic, it's patient. To give it a name without trapping it, think of a cyclotron mesa-like song trimmed down for small rooms. Electrons that spiral along field lines can radiate coherently when the conditions allow, especially where a sheath of plasma near the surface encourages preferred orbits and preferred angles. Near planets, this often blooms at long wavelengths. Near a compact, patchy surface, the same family of processes can shift higher when local densities and paths cooperate. Add uneven conductivity, and you shape what is allowed to sing. The result is not a blare, but a thread, narrow and steady, with enough organization to keep its pitch and enough natural imperfection to breathe. The harbour holds its tone, the tide does the phrasing. Rotation gives the phrasing a pulse we can feel. The mid-infrared light curve whispers a multi-hour spin, and our radio amplitude swells and thins in sympathy as different patches take their turn meeting the wind. Superposed on that slow turn lives a quicker, workaday cycle. A 40-something second rise that reads like a charge-discharge rhythm where currents gather along favourable seams, then slip away. The two clocks don't compete, they braid. One is the body's turning, The other is the neighborhood's habit of storing and releasing just enough energy to keep a metronome for the night shift. Let the room learn that braid and hold it for a breath. A window latch clicks once, then rests. The faint smell of warm dust near a lamp shades down as the filament cools. Distantly, a buoy bell, only imagined, yet near enough, marks a slow swing you can almost time by your chest. Air moves through a narrow vent with a small, rounded tone, then chooses silence. On the desk, a paper corner lifts, sets, lifts again, following currents too gentle to see. If you listen, the room has two tempos as well. The long drift of temperature settling, and the shorter beat of small sounds finding and leaving the ear. You float between them without effort, and they teach you how two clocks can agree without matching. Back at the graph, distance makes its claim with a softness that suits our story. As the traveller edges outward, the crest's pitch slides by a trace toward lower values, the Doppler sigh you would expect when separation grows. Intensity shrinks with the same courtesy, eased down by weaker solar wind and the geometry that slowly steals us from one another's best angles. That decline does not erase the mechanism, it verifies it. The harbour is the same, the tide is just farther away, and so the buoys knock less often. A model that wants to be believed must keep a modest budget. We compare the power in our line to the stream available from the sun at that distance, and ask for pennies, not bills. If a small fraction of the charged flow induces currents across a handful of conductive seams, and if a smaller fraction of that leaves as coherent radio, the totals sit comfortably below what the wind can spare. There is no need to borrow from unlikely reservoirs. The field does the guidance, the rotation schedules the exposure, the plasma provides the dancers, and the ledger balances without extravagance. Coherence is the trickiest word on the room, so we keep it on a leash. We do not need a perfect cavity or an immaculate resonator to keep our line tight. It is enough to have patches that act like short waveguides for charge, surfaces that keep currents together for just long enough to sing the same note, and a sheath of plasma that prefers some motions over others. In such places, small feedbacks appear. A path that once carried charge becomes slightly easier to follow on the next turn. A density that once allowed a favoured orbit becomes slightly more hospitable again. Not a lock, not a machine, just a tendency that helps a band stay narrow while everything else remains honest and a little irregular. The polarization we measure behaves like a compass for the model. On nights near stronger solar weather, total intensity climbs, while the preferred orientation remains largely itself, rotating only as the path through ambient electrons demands. That tells us the field near the source holds its structure, even when the river runs faster. It would be odd for a strictly chaotic outflow to maintain such courtesy. It is normal for a guided neighborhood to do so. When the river calms, the crest lowers, and the lean persists, like a buoy that still points along the channel even after the tide slackens. Viewed this way, the quick cycle and the slow turn are not mysteries. They are housekeeping. Charges gather along a seam, radiation escapes, local conditions reset, and the cycle refreshes on a timescale that the environment admits. As the rock turns, new seams face the wind, and the amplitude rises or rests. Across hours and days, the distance grows, and the tone walks gently downward. Across weeks, the sun's weather raises and lowers the floor. The chart's quiet beauty, is that no step requires an invention. Each follows from the same gentle pull. You can test a sketch like this without breaking its calm. Keep your windows open to the solar wind and call out the intervals when its pressure rises. The crest should lift. Track the polarization's steady lean. It should keep choosing the same family of angles. Watch the Doppler drift. It should slide without stutter. Stack more infrared and find that the warm blush grows when the radio sings and calms when the line quiets. None of these singly prove the harbour analogy, yet, together, they sketch its piers and ladders with enough detail to tie a small boat and trust it will be there in the morning. We end where we began, with motion meeting field and a tone that belongs to both. If there is a grace note to add, it is only this. Natural systems like to settle into arrangements that cost them the least complaint. The harbour boys align with the tide because that is what the tide asks of anything that floats. Our traveller aligns its brief currents with the wind because that is how charges find rest. The radio line we follow is that rest made visible. Let it. Dim like a candle that has warmed a small room for long enough, a glow rounding down to ember, a wick that persuades the air to go quiet. Carry that quiet forward, candle out. We learned to speak about it together, softly. When the first public notes were drafted, our sentences kept the shoulders they were born with, relaxed, careful, and free of the kinds of edges that media love and data do not deserve. Words like preliminary and consistent appeared, while message and anomaly stayed out in the hall. Each lab wrote its paragraph. Another lab trimmed it. A third one checked that the verbs did not run ahead of the plots. We named the instruments that were listening, and the band they shared. We promised follow-up and explained that the rhythm felt orderly, but had not earned any crowns. The ember glow of agreement spread across time zones without smoke or sparks. Behind those sentences lived a cadence of its own. We passed clean slices of time-stamped data through a shared door, verified clocks, and pinned the geometry to the wall so that any colleague could see the angles we saw. A light dashboard gathered the essentials without the vanity of too many colours. When each dish looked on, when it looked away, which polarization we favoured, which calibration tone had passed. Round-robin checks became routine. Someone in the south would replay a northern window. Someone on the coast would replicate an inland cut. Hours, not minutes. That was our speed. Enough time to let certainty get its shoes on, not so much that the story outran the tide that carried it. At the edges, smaller antennas in quiet fields added a human scale. A university group wrote and asked what a faint echo would look like if they could find it. We answered with kindness and a page of steps. An amateur array sent a nighttime image of a narrow ridge where the crest should be, and we smiled at the nerve it took to try. Their recordings were pale but aligned, the cadence matching our counts within the tolerance we had learned to trust. You will mostly get noise, we warned, and that is also a result. They sent noise many nights, which helped us just the same, because absence has a shape too. Out of this came habits we'll keep for the next visitor. When a narrowband rise appears in a quiet patch, a simple trigger asks for 3 things at once. A second ear in radio within a few hours, a quick infrared glance if the window allows, and a soft X-ray look if the sky agrees. On-off-source nods are logged in a standard form. Polarization gets a second pass before adjectives grow roots. A compact checklist travels with the file. Verify band plans, check satellite passes, align clocks, cross-correlate with solar wind monitors, then, and only then, share a paragraph with the world. Not a silver bullet, just a campfire list that anyone can read by low light. Let the room widen into that campfire for a minute. Screens dim to ember tones. Kettle breathes, but does not boil. Two chairs remember the weight they held yesterday and sigh in the same places. Paper edges curl slightly inward, then relax. Someone sets a mug down, and the porcelain meets wood with a round, hollow note. It fades into the soft whir of a small fan. Hiss from a pair of headphones rides just above silence, and then, kindly, steps below it. Light from a single lamp makes a circle that looks warmer than it is. Outside, a branch touches the window and retreats. Inside, nothing demands. Nothing explains. The ember glow holds, patient as a story told twice by a friend who knows when to pause. In that glow, the human part of the work found its level. A message from a younger team came with 3 good questions and 1 worry that they were bothering us. We wrote back to say that questions are part of the freight, and we were happy to carry them for a while. A veteran observer sent a single line, steady as ever, I see, and attached a shape our crest had worn the night before. A technician passed along a reminder about ground loops that had saved a project years earlier. We tried it again, and it was quietly useful. None of this made a headline. All of it kept the tone that let sleep stay close to the edge of the desk. We also made a small promise to ourselves about speed. Not every sound needs a live stream. We did share, often and clearly, but we kept our commas and our caveats, and we let the rhythm be a rhythm without laying a story over it too soon. The public notes stayed steady and polite, multi-instrument detections, intervals consistent with rotation and environment, ongoing RFI checks, correlations with solar wind conditions under review. The avoidance of triumph gave us something better than triumph: trust. It turns out the audience for careful work is larger than we sometimes think, especially at night, especially when the telling is made of low voices. What changed under our hands were the tools that serve the telling. A shared repository learned to accept plots that aligned themselves, time zones and baselines handled without complaint. A tiny bot posted reminders when a new solar wind shock passed L1, then matched that timestamp to open observation windows. The note going not to social feeds, but to the quiet rooms where such reminders belong. We added a tile to the dashboard for off-source nulls, so no one had to dig. We wrote gentle text that explains to newcomers why a clean null is as beautiful as a bright crest. The ember glow got a little brighter, and no alarms went off. Community, of course, extends beyond rooms with dishes. A teacher wrote to say that a classroom had been following the plots as a morning ritual, asking students to spot when the crest looked a bit taller, and to guess whether the sun had pushed harder overnight. We sent a short note back about patience, and how 2 things can be true at once, and why noise is a friend if you treat it well. Small Museum asked for permission to print one of the graphs as a poster. We said yes, and suggested a caption that avoided mystery while keeping wonder. It hung near a bench where, I hope, someone sat for a while and let their breathing copy the spacing on the page. In quieter corners of the network, the practice hardened into policy, but never into concrete. We agreed to meet the next narrowband stranger with the same campfire list. Listen twice before speaking once. Cross the bands if you can. Let amateurs try and welcome their noise. Publish the RFI checks with the same pride as the detections. Keep the adjectives short. Keep the nouns honest. Let the sun's weather share align with your plots. If a message ever comes, these habits will help us tell the difference. If it does not, these habits will still have been worth learning. The night train passes just then. Only a low hum felt more than heard, and the rails sing a single note that fades as the air closes behind it. The room holds the aftersound. The embers keep their colour. We listen well, and then we let the quiet pass. Night train, pass. 10 days, the crest stands a little lower. 20, lower still. 30, and the rise that once felt confident now brushes the baseline like a fingertip that has learned to whisper. We stack the nights and watch a number ladder step down, signal to noise easing by small, polite increments. A trace of pitch sliding toward the red, by amounts you have to lean in to see. The interval keeping its steady breath even as the world between us and the traveller grows wider. This is how distance speaks when it is in a kind mood, not by cutting the line, but by thinning it until only attention can hold it. By the next series, the decline has become a theme. Geometry changes first, angles nudging us off the most generous view. Then the solar wind slackens, and the river that once pressed hard against the visitor's skin runs lighter. The amplitude follows, as it should. The cadence stays, as it must. Frequency leans lower by a fraction. Nothing leaps, nothing breaks. The model earns its supper by being ordinary, weaker forcing, weaker light. The plot you could have predicted in pencil the first week keeps the faith in ink by the fourth. Let the shoreline teach the same lesson while your breath lengthens. A wave arrives, arranges small stones, and returns with less to say. Another follows, stops short of the old line, then fades into flat water that reflects a low, colourless sky. Far out, a bell marks the swell with patient, irregular time. The tide is leaving, and the beach gives back what it borrowed. One shell, one curl of weed, one shine of wet sand that cools almost to the touch. A gull lifts, decides otherwise, and settles again into the pale hush that fits this hour. Your shoulders copy the tide. The room grows larger by not changing at all. Position, meanwhile, firms up under better star maps. Gaia's quiet arithmetic sharpens the outbound track until the curve declares itself openly hyperbolic. Speed near 35 kilometers a second. The direction a clean line toward the long, thin dusk at the edge of our star's breath. We fold that path into the same frame as our crest and watch the two agree like travellers reading the same timetable. The farther from the centre, the gentler the push from the wind, the dimmer the radio. This is not a goodbye, only a longer hallway. Evidence loves company, so we ask the pitch to tell its part again. Session by session, the slight Doppler sag keeps time with separation, a downward trace as patient as a thermometer falling after sunset. When the sun coughs and the river thickens for a day, the crest still lifts on cue, but never to the old heights. Background trends win fights with weather. Our fit to the simple story improves by losing drama. Amplitude rides the square of distance and the pressure of the wind. Frequency obeys the small arithmetic of motion. The interval refuses to panic because rotation does not care how far a body is from the campfire. Beyond the last bright lanes of the planets, a boundary waits, more gradient than wall. We call its far face the heliopause, a place voyagers met around 120 astronomical units, where the sun's breath gives way to the larger hush between stars. It is not where our listening ends. It is where our expectations change. Past that, the river of particles that helped write our narrow band will be a rumour. The tone, if it survives at all, will belong more to the traveller's private field, and less to the warm hand that taught it to sing for us. As the separation grows and the wind's hand slackens, the crest thins and the noise learns to speak up. The polarization keeps leaning as it has leaned, though the line falls toward the floor. The interval holds with its tolerant breath. The pitch glides by grains toward lower numbers, and all of it adds up to a story that becomes soft, the way an afternoon becomes evening. Without an edge, without a bell, without a single moment you could point to and say, here is when the day decided to be night. There are small, stubborn remnants in the wake, faint ripples in the plots that appear after strong solar passages, echoes more of path than of source. We mark them lightly and move on. They are the kind of leftovers a river leaves when it ran high 2 days ago, and still persuades a backwater to turn a little longer than it should. They do not change the shape of the tide, they only decorate it. The broader curve keeps falling in the way you expect when energy spreads and angles wander from kind to merely adequate. In the rooms where we keep watch, the story gathers a humility that fits. The model needed to get weaker with distance. It did. The geometry needed to matter more. It does. The solar weather needed to become a seasonal influence rather than a governing mood. Has. What remains is half music, half memory. You can still see the crest most nights if you let your eyes soften, and you stand in the same place long enough. You can still feel the cadence, even when the line's height is a rumour. The sea does not stop to convince you it is leaving. It simply leaves. Breath out now, just once, a little longer than breath in. The beach keeps its shells. The horizon takes back the shine. The bell at sea grows smaller than your thoughts, then smaller than your pulse, then smaller than the space between the last two notes in a song you can't remember how to finish. The plots drift into a quieter stack. The pale hush does what it was going to do with or without you. Let the room keep one last grain of tide-cool air, and let your eyes close, because the work has become watching, and watching has become rest. In the notebook I keep for quiet nights, there's a penciled line next to a small sketch of a crest. No ink, just graphite, because pencil forgives revision, and revision is the truest friend of any lesson worth carrying forward. The line isn't dramatic. It rises a little, falls a little, and holds a steady tilt, just as our plots did when the story was new. When I turn that page now, I hear the soft scrape of the lead as if it was still being drawn, and I remember what the work taught in the gentlest way. Methods first, because methods are how we stay kind to the truth. Synchronize clocks until modesty feels like a reflex. Share windows of listening with the same courtesy you save for lending tools. Keep the on-off nods tidy, the polarization checks doubled, the geometries drawn in plain shapes that anyone could copy. When a line appears, invite 3 ears, not one, and let the third be far away. Publish the RFI cleaning with the same pride you spend on the detection. If a step can be routine, make it so. And if a step resists routine, admit it aloud. We learned that a rhythm becomes real not when it is loud, but when it survives ordinary doubt. Then the material lesson, which is simpler than it sounds. Not every traveller between stars is frosted glass and vapour. Some wear rock, some carry metal in veins and seams, some are quilts more than slabs. A dry skin, mottled with conductive traces, can answer a wind in ways a softer body cannot. Our visitor likely landed on that part of the spectrum of possibilities. The lack of easy comet songs, the quiet iron and nickel whisper, the modest warmth all pointed to a mix that made sense of the radio. We'll remember that when the next light curve tilts and the next crest stands where the band is calm. Tools changed under our hands, quietly. Dashboards learned to accept plots that lined themselves up, without fuss. Receivers in the mid-gigahertz lanes earned better ears. Lower noise, quicker calibration. Gentler ways of swapping polarization without losing the thread. A small bot learned to tap a shoulder when the solar wind crossed a threshold, then fell silent if the sky did not oblige. Even the file names improved, which sounds like nothing, until a tired person at 4 a.m. needs exactly the right slice from exactly the right night, and finds it, because the name tells the truth. The penciled line for those upgrades sits under the heading, "Make the next night easier." From method and tool to reach, lessons walked outward. Techniques we leaned on to follow a narrow band line through a noisy room can help us listen for magnetism in worlds we cannot see. Some exoplanets may carry fields that whisper at radio wavelengths, or wear plasma shells that speak when their stars breathe harder. Cross-timing against stellar wind monitors, pairing radio with a faint warmth in the infrared, treating polarization as a compass. These are habits we can bring to that search. None of it promises a quick yes. All of it promises cleaner maybes. The penciled line here curves toward patience shaped like a plan. There were dreams sketched at the page margins too. Mission concepts that wait in a drawer until the clock and the budget are in the right mood. An interceptor parked in a useful orbit, ready to meet the next visitor with a camera that doesn't blink, and a radio ear tuned to the band that soothed us this time. A small probe that tastes the plasma sheath and learns how a rough conductive surface stores a little charge and lets it go. Nothing baroque, nothing breathless. Simple instruments given good light, close enough to see the seams that rotation only hints at from here. If these sketches stay pencil for a while, that's fine. Graphite is patient, and the sky will oblige again. Let the room carry an echo of that pencil now. The page rustles when you shift your hand. A faint spiral of shavings collects near the sharpener cap. The lamp throws a warm oval on paper and leaves the corners dim, as if the next idea preferred the shadows for a minute longer. A distant hallway holds one step, and then none. The clock decides not to matter. You breathe in softly and out a little softer, and every line on the page looks more legible than it did a moment ago. This is where habits become comfort. The small comforts that carry science and sleep in the same pocket. I think often of the way a modest practice enlarges a world, a standard form for an off-source null, a one-page note that says when to call another dish, a shared repository that renders without complaint, a checklist that places satellite passes beside a simple cross-correlation. None of these would win a medal, yet together they turn a crowd into a circle and a noise into a tone, and they let a classroom and a big observatory handle the same plot with the same hands. And sometimes that is the difference between a rumour and a record, between a short night and an earned rest, between a story told at volume and one told at the hush. A room remembers long after the screens have gone dark, and the air has cooled, and a good pencil has rolled to the edge of the desk and stopped. What we keep, finally, is not an answer so much as a stance. Approach the next line with the same unhurried courtesy. Expect nature to prefer balance. Let rotation and field explain as much as they can before asking for more. Mark speculation where it starts and leave it in pencil. Invite more ears than your own. Save a space for amateurs and for students and for the museums where someone, without knowing why, will sit a while and breathe like the spacing on the graph. If the next visitor sings a different note, we'll learn that one too. If it sings none at all, we will have listened well. Here the notebook closes with a soft sound, and the page keeps its smudges like a map of attention. The penciled line is still there, a small hill in a quiet field. It stands for the kindness of good habits, the strength of patient tools, and the way a modest idea can hold its shape when many hands touch it lightly. I draw one last mark, a dot at the end of the line where this story lets go, and I let the lamp nod toward dark. Sleep well, traveller. Sleep well, listener. Soft, hard cut. Thank you for staying with me while the sky grew quiet. We listened to a narrow line hold its place while three far-flung dishes, Greenbank, Fast, and ALMA, took turns agreeing. The crest breathed near a 47-second rhythm, not perfect, not careless, like a small lighthouse turning. Polarization leaned the same way on many nights, the waves plane rotating gently as it crossed the electron fog between us. The pitch slid by a trace as distance grew, the Doppler sigh you expect when a traveller drifts outward. When the sun's wind thickened, the line stood a little taller. When the wind relaxed, it softened. Across other colours, the companionship stayed kind. Infrared warmed a touch when radio rose, soft X-rays perched just above the floor, and a faint optical light curve matched a multi-hour spin. After careful cleaning, off-source nulls, band masks, satellite checks, the room left nothing of itself on the page. What remained was a modest conversation between motion and field, written where our instruments could hear. As weeks gathered, geometry changed, and the crest thinned, just as a tide falls without drama. Gaia's track drew the outbound path cleanly hyperbolic. The cadence kept its tolerant breath, while intensity ebbed, and the tone walked a little lower, night by night. The story stayed ordinary in the most reassuring way. If you are drowsy now, you have done the work correctly. Let instruments idle. Let the shared note find its resting place. The next visitor may sing a different pitch, or none at all. We will meet it with the same unhurried care. For tonight, keep the simple picture. A patchwork traveller turning in warm wind, answering with a rhythm small enough to carry into sleep. Thank you for listening, for breathing with the graphs, for keeping company with the quiet. Good night.